All right, in this video, we're going to look at evolution in a little bit more depth. So we've looked at the basic mechanism of how natural selection works. We've looked at how we change the gene pool of populations. And now what I want to do is back away and start to look at the ways in which natural selection can shape species. Okay. So to begin with, one thing I do want to get out of the way is a couple of definitions. Macroevolution and microevolution are exactly what they sound like, right? The root word micro means small, right? And this is where what you've been focused on. You've been focused on changing gene pools and changing the frequencies of certain genes within their gene pools. And really what happens there is you don't change the whole species necessarily. You're changing small populations, which can lead to changing the entire species over time. Okay. Then you have macroevolution, and this is looking at large patterns of evolution over long periods of time. And this is where we start to get into the emergence of new species. So let's start digging into macroevolution a little bit. All right. So, first of all, remember that fitness is relative to the conditions that you're in, right? And it's you really don't have to be perfect. You just have to be more adapted than somebody else to survive, right? And to reproduce more successfully. Okay. So, fitness is relative within the environment and relative to others around you. And when we're talking about the struggle for survival, that struggle isn't always, tooth and claw fighting. It's not always a direct conflict. Okay. So you're not always going to see real violent clashes happening. You're just going to see um, species competing and somebody winning out on that competition for the most part. And depending on which traits are favored, there are three directions that natural selection can take a population in with respect to phenotypic variation. So these you learned about in baby bio. You have directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. And what I've done here is I've put like a quick summary in each of these, but I think what's easier to understand is examples and graphs. Okay. So let's take a look at this. We've got an example here of directional selection, changing the size of the body size of this cliff swallow population here. Notice. And I believe what's happening here is the light green is the initial population. So these would be the initial population categories. And then this dark green section that you see right here would be the population that's changed over time. Okay, so this is directional. And basically you've got sparrows that range from very, very small to very, very large, right? And what you can see is that you start with a bell curve here, right? That it's relatively a bell curve, right? Where the peak is here initially, right? They're in size class 6.5, right? But notice over time, this population's peak shifts to around 9. Okay, and that's what happens in directional selection. Natural selection, for one reason or another, favors a particular phenotype or a particular class of phenotypes over another set. And what happens is you take this population that has what we call a normal distribution with a normal bell curve, right? And as we apply selection, notice the bell curve has shifted. The peak of that bell curve has shifted over. It was here, now it's over slightly, right? That's what happens in directional selection. So for some reason, having a larger body size was advantageous in these cliff swallows. Maybe it helped them to evade predators better, right? Maybe females preferred the larger cliff swallow. Okay, so that's what directional selection looks like. You take a normal bell curve and you shift it over, actually. I keep forgetting I'm backward in the image, so you shift it over. Now, it's important to note that directional selection can go in either direction. It does not have to go shift to the right, like you're seeing in this particular situation. If there was some reason why having a smaller body size class would be advantageous, then you would see the shift going in the other direction. The key here is with directional selection, it goes in one direction or the other. Right. Then you have stabilizing selection, and stabilizing selection tends to reinforce um, the average, the normal, the peak of the bell curve. So again, you start with a normal distribution like that. Notice our peak continues to stay right at this same point the whole time. So the peak is still the same. The peak just gets more peaky, right? Notice that the lower fitness, the individuals that are less likely to survive, are on the extreme ends of the phenotype, right? And so their numbers drop and the average gets higher. All right. So again, if you look at birth weight for human infants, this is a great example of that. It kind of maintains that 7-pound birth rate. And what they've done is actually superimposed in this graph, superimposed the birth rate onto a mortality curve. And notice that you have high mortality at low birth weight, and high mortality at high birth weights. And so, babies that are really, really tiny when they're born are very fragile. They don't survive very well. Babies that are very large have a hard time getting into the world without a whole lot of intervention from doctors, and they don't survive very well either. That mid range is really the best, most adaptive weight. And over time, that 7-pound-ish weight has been the norm, right? And you can see that you're just maintaining the peaks. All right, so that was stabilizing. Now we're looking at disruptive selection. And this is another case where the extremes are favored, but this time instead of one extreme or the other, you're favoring both extremes. So again, we have this peak at our normal distribution right here, right in the middle, like we would expect. But notice what ends up happening is over time, you end up with two peaks in your graph, right? Something happens that makes the average individual less fit than the ones on both extremes. Okay, so if you look at this juvenile black-bellied seed cracker, if they have very large beaks or very short beaks, very long or very short beaks, they tend to survive better for whatever reason. Maybe the long-beaked ones could, exploit more food because either they can, get to seeds a little bit better, dig them out of places a little bit better than something with a medium-sized beak. The short-beaked birds might have a hard time or might have an easier time cracking the seeds because they've got more control and maybe a little bit more power in the muscles that control the beak. But either way, in this case, both extreme phenotypes are selected for, and it's the average that you see the dip in. So you end up with a two-peaked graph, a double peak on a graph. Right, so all of this is just normal directions that natural selection can take a species in. We must not forget to talk about artificial selection here. Remember that Darwin was a pigeon breeder. Okay, so Darwin would have been familiar with artificial selection. He may not have called it artificial selection, but that's exactly what it was. It's also called selective breeding, right? We've done this for centuries. Humans have done this for centuries. Selecting specific traits that we like, so that we have organisms doing things for us. So examples of this would be like dog breeding, right? Believe it or not, Chihuahuas, I always like to tell students, they have a purpose. They were bred in Mexico to chase rats. So they're small. Rats tend to live in dingy, spiderwebby, dusty places. So, a little doggy running through one of those places might be really nasty when it got out. So they're bred to have short hair for the most part, right? They're bred to be aggressive, right? All of those traits that you see in a Chihuahua actually has a purpose because humans needed the Chihuahuas to do a specific job. The problem with that is those are not necessarily traits that would allow the Chihuahua to survive in the natural environment very well. So while that's helpful for living with humans. If we released a pack of wild chihuahuas out into nature, they'd get very cold very quickly in a North Carolina winter. Even though it's not that cold, it's still cold enough to kill, unprotected animals. They might be picked off by predators pretty easily. We have coyotes and things that would very much like to get a hold of a chihuahua. Um, so those aren't necessarily traits that are great in the environment, but we've chosen them because we want them to do a specific job. There's also the example of the samurai crab, which you can see a picture of right there. If you look at the carapace of this crab right in here, I hope you can see a little human face there. And this particular species of crab in Japan was being fished for, and some crab had a mutation that made the little folds on the back of its carapace look like a human face. And a fisherman who picked that crab out of a net said, "This looks like a face. It looks like it's probably the spirit of a dead samurai," threw it back. Um, and over time, that turned out to be a trait that allowed the crabs to avoid predation from humans. And so now the crabs all have this little face on their back. Um, there's no other reason why that's advantageous. But because humans don't eat the crabs that have those faces, out of respect for the samurai, or the samurai spirit that they believe the crab to be, um, then it helps that crab to survive. All right, so if you're talking about macroevolution, you're talking about changing species over time, right? You're talking about making big changes to the species as a whole. We have to define what that means. What's a species, right? So there are a whole bunch of definitions of species. The one that is most popular and most commonly used is the biological species concept. And this was put forth by the biologist Ernst Mayr. And he said, a species is a group of populations whose members can interbreed in nature, keyword there, in nature, and produce fertile offspring. So it's a reproductive barrier that you're dealing with here, right? They have to naturally breed with one another, right? And when they breed, the offspring that they produce have to grow up to be able to be fertile themselves, not sterile. They have to be able to have their own babies. So in other words, you have to have individuals that are close together. That's the proximity part. And then that they are close enough that they can interbreed. So species are held together by proximity and interbreeding. So it makes sense then, if you use that particular definition, that in order to create a new species, you have to block either proximity or you have to block reproduction, right? So when we're talking about blocking reproduction, right, we're talking about reproductive isolation, right? So we're trying to isolate individuals, prevent them from breeding with one another. So any kind of reproductive isolation occurs because of a barrier that prevents viable offspring. There are hybrids, though, and we'll get into hybrids probably in the next video, but hybrids can exist. Some of them are sterile, but occasionally you'll get a hybrid zone where they're not sterile. So you can still get hybrids, right? If you mate, I can't remember if it's a male lion and a female tiger or vice versa, you can create a liger. I can pause for a second if you want to Google it because you can find pictures, but you can also find mules where you breed a donkey and a horse, and those are hybrids. Okay, so hybrids do exist, but again, we're talking about the reason why lions and tigers, for example, are different species is their hybrid cannot grow up and produce babies of its own, right? All right, so there are two types of barriers that you have then. There's the pre-zygotic, in other words, before a zygote can be formed, right? Remember, a zygote is that initial fertilized egg. That's called a zygote. Okay, so that's why it's pre-zygotic, before a zygote even can form. And then there are post-zygotic, after the zygote forms, that are barriers. So you can block fertilization. in some way, right? You're blocking fertilization. That's a prezygotic barrier, because you're preventing the creation of um, a zygote. So you can block mating, you can block the completion of mating, or you can prevent successful fertilization. Those are the three ways that you can do that. Post-zygotic barriers would prevent a hybrid from being able to successfully mate and have offspring. So once the hybrid exists, once the zygote had formed and then developed and you now have the hybrid, it's not able to reproduce. It's sterile. All right, so these are examples, and you're going to practice and play around with some of these in the activity that goes along with today. These are examples of prezygotic mechanisms. So the first, habitat isolation. When you have organisms occupying two completely different habitats, usually no proximity, right? You can have prezygotic isolation, right? If the animals can't get to each other to mate, then they're not going to mate. They can be closer together than you think. And again, we'll get into sympatric and allopatric speciation probably in the next video. Also, you can have temporal isolation. This is going to be a major issue in the future with global warming, because as global warming changes seasons in certain places, what happens is you're going to change the reproductive cycles of some groups of organisms within the species, while others may change differently. And what that means is now you've got species that would normally have their breeding time synced. Their breeding time won't be synced anymore. So when you have species breeding at different times, then you have what's called temporal isolation. So you have, and it's really not the species, it's populations within that species that are breeding at different times. And because they're breeding at different times, now this group is breeding at one time, this group is breeding at another. They're isolated from one another because they're not going into their mating season at the same time. You also have behavioral isolation. This is one of the reasons why, raising animals by hand is a problem, because when you raise animals by hand, if they imprint, they can miss out on the opportunity to learn all the behaviors that they need to be a part of their population. And if that's the case, then they won't have the ability to perform the courtship rituals that are needed to be able to actually mate with somebody else within their species. So they would be isolated. There's also mechanical isolation. So there's some difference in the physical structural shape of the organism that prevents mating, or organisms within different populations. And then there's also gametic isolation. Something happens where the sperm can't fuse with the egg for whatever reason. It's just not possible. So those are prezygotic barriers. All right, so post-zygotic barriers would be things like reduced hybrid viability, where the parental genes prevent the hybrid survival. So the hybrid just doesn't survive long enough to be able to reproduce. Maybe it would have been capable if it survived long enough. You also have sterility. Reduced hybrid fertility means you get sterility due to the inability to produce normal gametes. Typically, this is a problem due to a mismatched number of chromosomes, where if one species has one set of chromosomes and another species maybe has a different number of chromosomes in their set, you end up with these unpaired chromosomes that are non-homologous, and that really can reduce fertility, because you can't produce normal gametes from that, because you don't have all of the chromosomes with their homologs to be able to separate them during meiosis. So that's a problem. And then you also have hybrid breakdown, and this does occur with mules, where you can actually get the hybrids to mate with one another, but usually their offspring are not viable. They don't survive and or are not able to reproduce themselves. So there are some cases, for example, where they've mated mules with one another and gotten them to reproduce offspring, but their offspring aren't viable. All right. It's important to note that this biological species concept is not perfect, okay? I mentioned that there are lots of definitions of species. It's the big problem is looking at past species, right? You can't really tell what's the point at which this trilobite was reproductively isolated from that trilobite. We don't know. We don't really. All we've got is a fossil in front of us. Also, it doesn't address asexual reproduction, so there are some limits here. It's a great starting point, and it does make sense, right? It makes good common sense to think of it this way. But other people have proposed other definitions. So there's a morphological species concept um, that characterizes species by body shape and structure. Um, Excuse me, but the problem every time you start to get into morphology is you start to fall into pitfalls and traps where you have structures evolving not because they have a common ancestry and therefore they're part of the same species, but because they're convenient in a particular ecosystem. So that's a real drawback to that morphological species concept, and we'll get into that more as we go on with this unit. There's the ecological species concept, characterizes a species based on its niche, which is the role that it plays in its environment. But uh, it does not in any way bring up reproduction and hybrids and sterility and things like that, which does seem to have a certain amount at play. It also emphasizes the role of disruptive selection in speciation. You know, this separation of organisms because they have to occupy different niches. And I know we haven't had ecology yet, but if you had apes, you remember, or only one group of organisms can occupy a niche. Otherwise, you're going to get competition. There's also the phylogenetic species concept. Smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor would be a species. Um, it's hard to figure out at what point does one species become another then, right? Um, and that's kind of the critical question with species in general, especially when you get variations within the species. At what point does this variation and this variation become two separate species? And there's no determining point with that phylogenetic species concept, the way that there is with the biological species concept. You know, the point where this one can no longer mate with this one and produce fertile offspring. Boom, there it is. Now they're two separate species, right?